In the summer of 1839, the Spanish schooner Amistad accidentally sailed into United States waters. After the ship left Havana, Cuba, enslaved Africans on board revolted, killed the captain, and seized control of the vessel. They attempted to sail back to Africa, but the badly damaged vessel eventually drifted to Long Island Sound, where it was boarded by the crew of a U.S. Navy ship. But that's only the beginning. Here with the rest of the story is my colleague, Bob Fagan.
The naval crew took custody of the Amistad, its cargo, and the 42 Africans on board. They towed the ship to New London, Connecticut, a state where slavery was legal, intending to file a salvage claim in the courts. Under the laws of salvage, anyone who rescued a ship from danger was entitled to a portion of the value of the ship and its cargo. The Amistad case entered the federal courts in August of 1839, when District Court Judge Andrew Judson convened a court of inquiry and heard testimony from the Spanish planters who claimed to own the Africans, and from Antonio, a slave who was cabin boy for the Amistad's slain captain. Judson held that the case presented both criminal and civil claims. He kept the salvage claim in the district court and referred the criminal case, the revolt and murder at sea, to the circuit court. At that time, federal circuit courts were mainly higher-level trial courts. The Amistad case generated much public interest, both in the captives, who were from the Mendi region of West Africa, and in questions of law and jurisdiction. Anti-slavery activists saw the case as an opportunity to build support for the abolition of slavery. These abolitionists formed committees to help the Africans in court. At the Circuit Court in Hartford, Connecticut in September, Justice Smith Thompson ruled that no federal court had jurisdiction over an act that occurred on a foreign vessel at sea. This ruling eliminated all threat of criminal prosecution of the Africans. Their fate now depended upon their status as property rather than any accusation of wrongdoing. The trial regarding the salvage claims began in January 1840 in the District Court in New Haven. There was no jury, and the case's determination rested solely with Judge Judson. The strategy of the lawyers recruited by the Abolitionist Committee was to win the court's acknowledgement that slavery violated natural rights, those rights to which every human is entitled, regardless of any nation's laws. They also argued that the Mendi's enslavement violated Spain's own laws. The trial reached its dramatic high point when one of the enslaved Africans, who had become known as Cinque, described his capture by slave traders in West Africa and the horrific voyage across the Atlantic in the suffocating hold of a slave ship. After 5 days of testimony, Judson read his decision. The naval crew was entitled to a salvage award for the ship and its non-human cargo. But he denied a salvage award for rescuing the Africans, because even though slavery was legal in Connecticut, slave sales were not. And so the court had no way to determine their monetary worth. Judson also ruled that because there was no proof of ownership, the Mendi were not lawfully held property of the Spanish planters. And finally, he ruled that because Antonio, the cabin boy, was born in Spanish territory as a slave, he was the legal property of the captain and must be delivered to Spanish officials. Judson's decision was appealed to the Circuit Court, which quickly upheld his rulings in order to speed the certain appeal to the Supreme Court. The case came before the Supreme Court in its January 1841 term. How the court would rule was unpredictable. The court had always protected the property rights of slaveholders at the same time that it enforced restrictions on the slave trade. Former President John Quincy Adams had joined the group of lawyers representing the Mendi. His emotional argument invoked the principle of natural rights as embodied in the Declaration of Independence. On March 9, 1841, the court's senior justice, Joseph Story, delivered his opinion for the majority of the Supreme Court. The district court's ruling that the Mendi were not legally held property was upheld, and the captives were finally given their unconditional freedom. The decision that freed these captives offered no legal relief to the nearly 3 million residents of the United States held in slavery. nor did it serve as a precedent for legal challenges to slavery. The Supreme Court let stand the district court's ruling that the cabin boy, Antonio, was a slave under Spanish law. But the widely reported proceedings in the federal courts did highlight the fragile legal principles and political compromises supporting slavery. The main impact of the Amistad case was to encourage the growing opposition to slavery in the United States. That's a moment in court history.